I never thought I'd be hiding in a kitchen pantry during my own son's wedding, pressed against cold shelves while champagne glasses clinked just 20 feet away. But when I heard those final words escape my dying son's lips, words that shattered everything his bride thought she knew, I watched her collapse to the marble floor like a broken doll, and suddenly every cruel thing his wife's family had done to me made perfect, devastating sense. My name is Margaret, and after 32 years of being the perfect mother, I discovered I was nothing more than an inconvenience to be hidden away on the most important day of my child's life. But what they didn't know was that I was about to become their worst nightmare. Like and subscribe if you want to hear more shocking family stories like this one. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began, because the signs were always there. I was just too blinded by love to see them. David was my miracle baby, born after 7 years of failed pregnancies and countless nights of tears soaking my pillow. When he finally arrived, pink and screaming and perfect, I held him against my chest and promised him everything, every breath in my lungs, every beat of my heart, every tomorrow I had left. His father, Robert, had walked out when David was only 3, unable to handle what he called the intensity of my love for our son. "It's not natural, Margaret," he'd said, stuffing clothes into a suitcase while David napped in his crib. "A child needs space to breathe." But Robert was wrong. David and I were a team. Through his childhood scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks, through college applications and his first job interview, we faced everything together. Our small apartment above the bakery smelled like cinnamon and vanilla, filled with David's laughter and my old jazz records spinning on repeat. Every Sunday, we'd make pancakes and plan our week, his head on my shoulder as we watched old movies on our tiny television. "You're the best mom in the world," he'd whisper during those quiet moments, and I believed him. I believed we were unbreakable. David was 26 when he met Sophia at a corporate networking event downtown. She was everything I wasn't. Tall where I was short, polished where I was simple, silver-spooned where I was self-made. Her family owned 3 restaurants across the city, lived in a house that could fit my entire apartment in their foyer, and spoke in the kind of measured tones that made you feel small, without them saying anything particularly cruel. The first time David brought her to dinner, I spent 3 days preparing. I cleaned every corner of our little apartment until it sparkled, bought fresh flowers for the table, and made my famous beef stroganoff, David's favorite since he was 8 years old. I wore my best dress, the navy one with tiny pearl buttons that I'd bought for my cousin's funeral, but never had another occasion to wear. Sophia arrived 45 minutes late, her heels clicking against our hardwood floors like a countdown timer. She was beautiful in that effortless way that comes from good genetics and better skincare, her blonde hair falling in perfect waves over her shoulders. But it was her eyes that unsettled me. They moved over our small space like a real estate appraiser calculating square footage and finding everything wanting. "What a cozy space," she said, her smile sharp as glass. She picked at my stroganoff, pushing the noodles around her plate while asking polite questions that felt like tiny knives. How long had I lived here? Was I planning to renovate? Did I ever think about moving somewhere more suitable? David laughed nervously, jumping between my responses and her observations like a referee in a match I didn't know I was losing. When she excused herself to the bathroom, he leaned over and whispered, "She's just nervous, Mom. She really wants to impress you." But I could see it in her posture, hear it in the careful way she pronounced certain words. I wasn't someone she wanted to impress. I was someone she wanted to improve, or better yet, replace. Over the next 6 months, I watched my son transform. The boy who used to call me every morning before work suddenly went days without contact. Our Sunday pancake tradition became, "Maybe next week, Mom. Sophia has this thing." The jazz records gathered dust as David learned to appreciate classical music. His worn jeans replaced by pressed slacks and button-down shirts that made him look like a stranger wearing my child's face. "You look tired, sweetheart," I'd tell him during our increasingly rare visits, and he'd wave off my concern. "Just busy with work and wedding planning. You know how it is." But I didn't know how it was, because nobody had asked me to help plan anything. When I offered to make the wedding cake, I'd been perfecting recipes for decades at the bakery. Sophia's mother, Eleanor, smiled that same glass-sharp smile and said they'd already commissioned something from a professional. When I suggested hosting the bridal shower at the community center where David had played basketball as a child, she explained they'd reserved the country club instead. "More appropriate for our guests," she'd said. the word our landing like a physical blow. Every tradition I'd imagined sharing with my son, the mother-son dance I'd been dreaming about since he was 5, the toast I'd been mentally writing for years, was quietly absorbed into the Whitmore family machine. They had opinions about flowers and venues, guest lists and music, catering and photography. They had opinions about everything except me. "Where would you like me to sit at the ceremony?" I asked David 3 weeks before the wedding, trying to keep my voice light. He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Sophia's family has a system. Her mom knows all about this stuff. She'll figure it out." But Eleanor's system apparently involved placing me in the 3rd row, behind cousins I'd never met, and college friends who barely knew David existed. When I suggested maybe I could sit in the 2nd row, not the front, I understood that belonged to Eleanor, but perhaps closer. She tilted her head and smiled. "Oh, Margaret, family seating is so complicated. Trust me, I've been doing this for years. Your spot will be perfect." Perfect for whom? I wondered, but I didn't ask. The lies started small, almost insignificant. David would mention dinner plans with just the 2 of us. Then Sophia would post photos from restaurants with her parents in the background. Wedding dress shopping became a girls-only event that somehow included 3 of Sophia's colleagues, but not her future mother-in-law. When I asked about the rehearsal dinner, David looked genuinely confused. "The rehearsal dinner? It's just immediate family, Mom. Small and simple." I found out later it was held at the Whitmore family's country club, 60 people in attendance, including Sophia's college roommate from California and her brother's girlfriend of 3 months. Apparently, immediate family was more flexible than I'd understood. The morning of the wedding, I woke up with a knot in my stomach that had nothing to do with excitement. I'd bought a new dress, a soft lavender color that complemented my eyes, and spent extra time on my hair and makeup. This was my son's wedding day. Whatever small slights and oversights had happened during the planning, surely today would be about family coming together. David called at 7 a.m., his voice tight with stress. "Mom, I need a huge favor." "Anything, sweetheart. What do you need?" "Could you come to the venue early? Like, really early? Eleanor needs someone to coordinate with the caterers. And you know how good you are with organizing things from the bakery." It should have been my first warning. Eleanor Whitmore had been planning events for decades. She hardly needed help from a small-town baker. But I was so grateful to finally be included, to have something important to contribute, that I ignored the voice in my head, screaming that something was wrong. I arrived at the Rosewood Manor at 8 a.m., my good shoes clicking against the marble entryway. The venue was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers casting rainbow patterns across cream-colored walls, enormous windows overlooking manicured gardens, fresh flowers arranged in displays that probably cost more than my monthly rent. For a moment, I felt proud. My son deserved this kind of beauty, this kind of celebration. Eleanor met me at the entrance, perfectly put together despite the early hour. "Margaret, thank you so much for coming early. You're such a lifesaver." She led me through the main hall, where workers were arranging round tables with gold-trimmed china and crystal glasses that caught the morning light. Past the dance floor, where my son would take his first steps as a married man. Past the altar where he'd promised to love someone forever. We kept walking. Through a service corridor, past the bridal suite where I could hear Sophia's laughter mixing with her bridesmaids' excited chatter. Through another hallway, deeper into the building's working areas. Finally, we stopped at a door marked Catering Services. "Here we are," Eleanor said brightly. "The kitchen staff is just beyond here. They'll show you what needs to be done." She opened the door to reveal a bustling commercial kitchen, all stainless steel surfaces and organized chaos. Workers moved efficiently between stations, preparing what looked like enough food for a small army. The head chef, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, glanced up from a clipboard. "Are you the family coordinator?" she asked me. "We have everything under control back here, but if you could just keep an eye on things, make sure the servers are staying on schedule, that would be great. There's a small office right through there where you can wait. We'll call if we need anything." The office turned out to be more of a storage closet with a desk, squeezed between industrial-sized refrigerators and shelves stocked with linens. I could hear the kitchen activity on one side, and through a small window that looked out to the service corridor, I could see staff members rushing back and forth with flowers and last-minute preparations. I waited for someone to explain what I was supposed to coordinate. I waited for Eleanor to return with actual instructions. I waited for David to appear with a grateful smile and a hug, thanking me for helping make his day perfect. What I got instead was the slow, sinking realization that I'd been hidden away like an embarrassment. The wedding was scheduled to start at 4 p.m. At 3:30, I heard music beginning in the main hall. the string quartet warming up, guests arriving and finding their seats. I could hear the excitement in voices carried through the building's ventilation system, the kind of joyous anticipation that should have included me. At 3:45, I opened the storage closet door and walked through the kitchen toward the main hall. If I was quick, I could slip into my third-row seat before the processional began. Nobody would notice one small woman finding her place among the other relatives. But the hallway leading back to the main hall was blocked by a security guard, a young man in a black suit who looked apologetic, but firm. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you supposed to be back here?" "I'm the groom's mother," I said, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. I was helping with catering coordination, but the ceremony is about to start. He checked a list on his clipboard, frowning. "I don't see you on the approved list for the main hall during the ceremony. Are you sure you're supposed to be out there right now?" Before I could answer, Eleanor appeared behind him, her face a mask of concerned politeness. "Margaret, what are you doing? I thought you were coordinating with the caterers." "The ceremony is starting," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "I need to get to my seat." "Oh, honey." Eleanor's expression shifted to something that might have been pity if it hadn't been so condescending. "I'm so sorry. I thought David explained. We had to make some last-minute adjustments to the seating arrangement. Family politics, you know how it is. We've arranged for you to watch from the service balcony upstairs. You'll have a perfect view of everything, and it'll be much quieter, more comfortable." The service balcony turned out to be a small viewing area above the kitchen, originally designed for event coordinators to oversee their staff during large functions. It had a view of the main hall through a one-way window. I could see everything, but nobody could see me. I watched my son's wedding like a ghost haunting her own life. David stood at the altar in his perfect black tuxedo, more handsome than I'd ever seen him. His best friend Marcus stood beside him as best man, a choice that had surprised me since David used to complain about Marcus's drinking and unreliability. But Sophia had introduced them to Marcus's sister, who was apparently very connected in David's industry. The bridesmaids processed down the aisle in flowing sage green dresses, each one tall and elegant, and completely unknown to me. These were Sophia's sorority sisters, her work colleagues, her cousin from Seattle. David's side of the wedding party consisted entirely of men he'd met through Sophia, her brother, her best friend's boyfriend, Marcus, with his newly reformed image. When the wedding march began, I pressed my face against the glass and watched my son's expression transform. Pure joy spread across his face as Sophia appeared at the end of the aisle, a vision in white silk and French lace. Eleanor walked beside her. Sophia's father had passed away when she was in college, and I could see the pride radiating from both women. It was beautiful. It was perfect. It was everything a mother dreams of for her child, and I was watching it through a kitchen window like a stranger. The ceremony itself was elegant and impersonal, full of classical music and poetry readings from people I didn't recognize. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to the union, my breath caught in my throat. Not because I wanted to object. I wanted my son to be happy, but because the question felt like mockery. How could I object from a hidden balcony where nobody knew I existed? Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell to never miss these incredible real-life stories. They exchanged rings, white gold bands that Sophia had chosen during a shopping trip I wasn't invited on. They recited vows they'd written themselves, beautiful words about partnership and growth and building a future together. Sophia spoke about David teaching her to see the world differently, about falling in love with his kindness and ambition. David talked about finding his other half, about becoming the man he was meant to be with Sophia by his side. Neither of them mentioned family. Neither of them mentioned the past. It was as if David had sprung into existence fully formed at 26, with no history or connections beyond this moment, this woman, this new life they were creating together. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the entire hall erupted in applause and cheers. David kissed his bride with a passion that made my chest ache, not because it wasn't beautiful, but because it felt like watching him fall in love with someone else's life. The reception began immediately after the ceremony, with cocktails on the garden terrace and a jazz trio playing standards that reminded me painfully of the music David and I used to share. Through my window, I watched the guests flow between the garden and the main hall. Elegant women in designer dresses and men in expensive suits. everyone perfectly at ease in this world of quiet luxury. I saw David's college roommate, his high school math teacher who'd written his recommendation letters, his boss from his first internship. I saw people who'd known my son for months being greeted with more warmth than I'd received in over a year. They had champagne flutes and passed appetizers and animated conversations about David's work, his travels with Sophia, their plans for a honeymoon in Greece. Nobody mentioned the woman who'd raised him. Nobody asked where his mother was, or why she wasn't dancing with her son, or giving a toast to the happy couple. At 7 p.m., dinner was served, and I watched from my perch as Eleanor rose to give a speech. She spoke beautifully about welcoming David into their family, about watching Sophia grow into a strong, independent woman who'd chosen a partner worthy of her love. She talked about tradition and values, about the importance of building a marriage on a foundation of shared goals and mutual respect. To David and Sophia, she concluded, raising her champagne glass high, may your love story inspire us all. The toast was followed by Marcus's best man speech, which was charming and funny and completely focused on David's transformation over the past year. According to Marcus, David had evolved from a workaholic with simple tastes into a sophisticated man who appreciated fine wine and classical music, who knew the difference between good art and great art, who'd learned to dream bigger than he'd ever imagined possible. Sophia didn't just steal his heart, Marcus concluded with a grin. She upgraded his entire operating system, and we're all better for it. More applause, more laughter, more celebration of the new David who bore so little resemblance to the boy I'd raised that I wondered if I'd imagined the first 26 years of his life. The father-daughter dance was next, Eleanor and Sophia swaying to "The Way You Look Tonight," while David watched with adoring eyes. It was sweet and touching, and absolutely none of my business, apparently. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for since David was 5 years old, and told me we'd dance together at his wedding someday, the mother-son dance. Except there wasn't one. Instead, the DJ announced that David and Sophia had chosen to have a second dance together, this one to At Last by Etta James. I watched my son hold his wife close, spinning her gently around the dance floor while their guests formed a circle around them. It was romantic and intimate and completely appropriate, but it wasn't what we'd planned. It wasn't what he'd promised me during those quiet Sunday mornings when we'd dreamed about his future wedding. As the evening wore on, I found myself studying the faces in the crowd, looking for any sign that someone was wondering where I was. David's high school English teacher was there. Surely she'd ask about me. His college girlfriend's mother, who'd always been kind to me during holiday gatherings. Anyone who might remember that David Anderson had a mother who loved him. But nobody seemed to notice the absence. The wedding was complete without me. The celebration was perfect in its current form. I was not missing. I had never been part of the plan to begin with. At 9 p.m., the cake cutting began, and I watched through my window as David and Sophia posed with a 3-tiered masterpiece covered in sugar flowers and gold leaf details. It was stunning, professional, nothing like the simple chocolate cake with buttercream roses that David had always requested for his birthday. Sophia fed him a small bite while photographers captured every angle, and he laughed at something she whispered in his ear. They looked happy. They looked perfect. They looked like they belonged in this world of understated elegance and quiet wealth, where mothers-in-law were decorative accessories rather than fundamental family members. Around 10 p.m., I heard footsteps in the service corridor outside my balcony hiding spot. The catering manager appeared with a plate of food and a glass of water. "Mrs. Anderson? I thought you might be hungry. The kitchen saved you a plate from dinner." It was the first time anyone had acknowledged my existence as a human being rather than a logistical problem since I'd arrived at the venue. The plate held a portion of filet mignon, roasted vegetables, and something involving truffle oil that smelled expensive. It was delicious and completely wrong. Fancy food eaten alone in a storage room while my son celebrated with people who'd known him for a fraction of the time I had. "Thank you," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. The catering manager hesitated at the door. "Are you okay? You've been up here for a long time." I almost laughed. Was I okay? My son had hidden me in a kitchen during his wedding reception. My future daughter-in-law had systematically erased me from every meaningful moment of the celebration. I was eating gourmet food in isolation while listening to the sound of my child dancing with everyone except me. "I'm fine," I said, because what else was there to say? But I wasn't fine. With each passing hour, I was becoming something else entirely. The hurt was crystallizing into something harder, sharper, more dangerous. I was becoming a woman with nothing left to lose. At 11 p.m., the DJ announced the last dance, and couples filled the floor for a slow, romantic song that felt like a lullaby. I could see David and Sophia in the center of it all, lost in their own world, whispering promises and jokes that nobody else could hear. Around them, Eleanor danced with her brother, Marcus spun one of the bridesmaids, and even the elderly relatives found partners for one final moment of celebration. I stood at my window, alone in my storage room, watching my son's happiness from behind glass like an exhibit I wasn't allowed to touch. That's when I heard voices in the corridor below my balcony. Eleanor and one of her sisters speaking in low tones as they walked toward the main hall. "Handled that perfectly," Eleanor was saying. "David was so worried about how to manage the situation, but this worked out beautifully. She seemed nice enough when I met her," the sister replied. "A little intense, maybe, but harmless." "Oh, she's sweet. Just very—" Eleanor paused, searching for the right word. "Attached. David said she had trouble letting him grow up. Called every day. Wanted to be involved in everything. It wasn't healthy." My hands clenched around the window ledge until my knuckles went white. "Still, it seems harsh to exclude her completely." "We didn't exclude her." Eleanor's voice carried a note of defensiveness. "She's here, isn't she? We found a way to include her without making everyone uncomfortable." David was so relieved when I suggested this arrangement. He said she'd probably prefer watching from somewhere quiet anyway. She gets anxious in crowds. I had never once told David I was anxious in crowds. I'd been working with the public at the bakery for 15 years, handling wedding orders and birthday parties and community events without a moment's discomfort. The only thing that made me anxious was being treated like an inconvenience by people who should have welcomed me as family. And Sophia? Sophia was very gracious about the whole thing. She tried to include Margaret in the planning, but you know how it is when someone doesn't really fit the vision. It's better this way. Everyone gets what they want. Everyone except me, I thought bitterly. Everyone except the woman who'd raised the groom from scratch, who'd sacrificed her own dreams to give him every opportunity, who'd loved him before he was successful or sophisticated or worthy of a Whitmore daughter. The voices faded as they returned to the reception, leaving me alone with the truth. This wasn't an oversight or a miscommunication. This was a deliberate choice, carefully planned and executed with my own son's full knowledge and consent. David hadn't just allowed them to hide me, he'd asked them to. The reception was winding down, guests beginning to say their goodbyes and collect their favor boxes, small packages of expensive chocolates tied with silk ribbons. Through my window, I watched David and Sophia make their rounds, hugging relatives and friends, accepting congratulations and well wishes for their future together. I waited for David to look around, to realize something was missing, to ask where his mother had gone. I waited for him to remember the woman who'd taught him to tie his shoes and drive a car, and believe in himself when nobody else would. But he never looked up at my window. He never asked the question I desperately needed him to ask. At midnight, the newlyweds made their grand exit, running through a tunnel of sparklers while their guests cheered and threw rose petals. A white limousine waited to take them to the airport for the start of their honeymoon, and I watched my son kiss his bride one more time before they disappeared into their new life together. The main hall began to empty, guests filtering out to the valet station where their expensive cars waited in perfect lines. The catering staff started breaking down tables and collecting dishes, the efficient ballet of professional event workers who'd done this dance 1,000 times before. Nobody came to collect me. At 12:30 a.m., I finally left my hiding spot and made my way through the empty corridors toward the exit. The venue looked different in its post-party state, wilted flowers and champagne stains, the detritus of celebration scattered across marble floors. What had been magical a few hours earlier now looked tired and slightly sad, like a theater after the audience has gone home. I was almost to the main entrance when I heard voices from one of the side rooms, the bridal suite where Sophia had prepared for her wedding. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, I could see Eleanor and two of Sophia's bridesmaids packing up the remnants of the day's preparations. "Went perfectly," one of the bridesmaids was saying. Sophia looked absolutely gorgeous. "The whole thing was flawless," Eleanor agreed. "Even the mother situation worked out better than I expected." I froze in the corridor. "I still can't believe David's mom didn't make more of a fuss," the other bridesmaid said. "If someone tried to exclude my mother from my wedding, she'd have burned the place down." Eleanor laughed, a sound like crystal bells that made my skin crawl. "Oh, Margaret's not the type. She's very passive. David said she never really stood up for herself, even when his father left. She just accepted whatever happened to her. Still, it seems cruel. Honestly, Eleanor's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. It was a kindness. Margaret would have been so out of place here. She would have felt uncomfortable, and that would have made everyone else uncomfortable too. This way, she got to see her son get married without having to pretend she belonged in our world. Our world. As if love and motherhood and 32 years of devotion counted for nothing against the right zip code and finishing school manners. What about David? Doesn't he feel guilty? David understands that sometimes you have to make hard choices for the greater good. He loves his mother, of course, but he also recognizes that she represents a part of his life he's outgrown. This marriage is about his future, not his past. I pressed my back against the corridor wall, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure they'd hear it through the door. David had discussed me like I was an embarrassing childhood habit he needed to break. He'd agreed to my exile, had probably suggested it himself. Besides, Eleanor continued, it's not like she was completely excluded. She was here, she saw the ceremony, she knows her son is happy. What more could she really want? What more could I want? I wanted to dance with my son. I wanted to give a toast celebrating the boy who'd grown into a good man despite his father's abandonment. I wanted to be introduced to his new relatives as someone who mattered, someone who'd earned a place at this table through decades of love and sacrifice. I wanted to be treated like a mother instead of a burden. But standing in that corridor, listening to Eleanor dismiss my pain like it was nothing more than wounded pride, I realized I wanted something else even more. I wanted revenge. Smash that like button if you think Margaret deserves justice, and subscribe for more incredible family drama stories. The next few weeks passed in a haze of forced normalcy. David called me twice from his honeymoon in Greece. Brief conversations full of tourist adventures and careful enthusiasm. He sounded happy, relaxed, like a man who'd successfully solved a difficult problem and moved on to better things. The islands are incredible, Mom. Sophia found this little restaurant that's been in the same family for 6 generations. You'd love their pastries. I wanted to ask him why he'd hidden me in a kitchen. I wanted to demand an explanation for 32 years of love being dismissed like it was nothing. I wanted to scream until my voice gave out and he understood the magnitude of what he'd done. Instead, I said, "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so glad you're having a good time." Because that's what passive people do. That's what women like Margaret Anderson do. We swallow our pain and pretend everything is fine because making waves is more frightening than drowning quietly. But I was learning something about myself in those dark weeks after the wedding. I was learning that there's a difference between being passive and being patient. I was learning that sometimes the quietest people have the most dangerous anger, the kind that burns slow and steady until it consumes everything in its path. I was learning that I wasn't nearly as helpless as everyone believed. David and Sophia returned from their honeymoon on a Tuesday, and I waited until Thursday to call. I wanted to give them time to settle in, to adjust to married life in the elegant condo Sophia's family had given them as a wedding gift. I wanted to be considerate, understanding, the perfect mother-in-law who knew her place. "Mom, how are you?" David sounded genuinely pleased to hear from me, which somehow made everything worse. "I'm fine, sweetheart. How was the rest of your trip?" He launched into stories about ancient ruins and sunset dinners, romantic boat rides and perfect weather. He sounded like he was reading from a travel brochure, all superlatives and surface-level excitement. "We brought you back something special," he said. "Maybe we could have dinner this weekend. I know Sophia would love to see you." The suggestion was casual, almost careless, like he was arranging a playdate between acquaintances. No acknowledgement of what had happened at the wedding, no recognition that anything might need to be addressed or explained. "That sounds lovely," I heard myself say. "Should I cook, or would you prefer to go out? Actually, why don't we come to you? Sophia's never seen your apartment, and she's been curious about where I grew up." Curious, like I was a historical site she wanted to tour, a quaint museum dedicated to David's humble beginnings. They arrived on Saturday evening with a gift bag from a high-end boutique in Athens and smiles that felt rehearsed. Sophia looked beautiful and tanned, her blonde hair lightened by Mediterranean sun, her engagement ring catching the lamplight as she gestured while telling stories about their adventures. David was so brave, she said, curling into his side on my small sofa. We went cliff diving on this tiny island, and he jumped first to make sure it was safe for me. He's so protective. I served dinner, David's favorite pot roast with mashed potatoes and green beans, and listened to them describe their new life together. They'd enrolled in couples cooking classes, joined a tennis club, started planning renovations for their condo. Everything was we now, a unified front of shared interests and coordinated schedules. The cooking classes are amazing, Sophia bubbled. We're learning French techniques. Last week we made this incredible coq au vin that was better than anything I've had in restaurants. She said it like it was a revolutionary discovery, as if good food was something that required expensive classes rather than years of practice and love. I thought about the thousands of meals I'd cooked for David, the birthday cakes and comfort foods and Sunday dinners that had shaped his childhood, and wondered if any of it counted as real cooking in her world. During dessert, store-bought tiramisu because apparently my homemade apple pie wasn't sophisticated enough, Sophia finally addressed the wedding. I hope you enjoyed the ceremony, Margaret. I know the day was a little hectic, but it meant so much to us that you were there. Her tone was bright and gracious, like she was thanking me for attending someone else's event as a favor. No acknowledgement of my exile, no recognition that anything unusual had happened. It was beautiful, I said carefully. You looked stunning. Eleanor did such an amazing job with all the planning. I honestly don't know how she managed everything so perfectly. She thought of details I never would have considered, like where to hide the inconvenient mother-in-law, I thought, but didn't say. David reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'm glad you got to meet more of Sophia's family. They've all said such nice things about you. I wondered what they could possibly have said, since none of them had spoken to me for more than 30 seconds. But I smiled and nodded, and played my part in this strange performance where we all pretended the wedding had been a normal family celebration. After they left, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by dirty dishes and expensive gifts I'd never use, and I realized something important. They weren't going to acknowledge what they'd done. There would be no apology, no explanation, no moment of recognition that my feelings had been hurt or my dignity had been trampled. In their minds, the wedding had been perfect precisely because I'd been managed so effectively. They'd solved the Margaret problem with elegant efficiency, and now we could all move forward with our assigned roles clearly defined. David would be the beloved son and husband, successful and sophisticated, unburdened by the messiness of his past. Sophia would be the perfect wife, bringing culture and connections to elevate their shared future. Eleanor would be the wise matriarch, guiding the young couple with experience and social grace. And I would be the grateful mother, thankful for whatever scraps of attention they chose to throw my way, never complaining or demanding or making anyone uncomfortable with inconvenient emotions, except I was discovering that I wasn't grateful at all. I was furious. The breaking point came 3 weeks later, when David called to invite me to Sunday dinner at their condo. It sounded like a peace offering, a gesture toward including me in their new routine, until he mentioned the guest list. Sophia's brother and his wife are coming, and Eleanor, and maybe Marcus and his girlfriend. It'll be casual, just family and close friends. Family and close friends, which apparently didn't include me by default. I was being invited as a courtesy, a afterthought addition to their real guest list. That sounds lovely, I said, because that's what I always said. What can I bring? Oh, don't worry about bringing anything. Sophia has it all planned out. Just come hungry and ready to relax. Don't worry about bringing anything. Don't contribute. Don't participate. Don't presume to add your own touch to the meal. Just show up and be grateful for the invitation. Sunday dinner at David and Sophia's condo was a masterclass in subtle exclusion. Their home was gorgeous. High ceilings and marble countertops, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Everything was perfectly coordinated, from the color-matched throw pillows to the carefully arranged coffee table books about art and architecture. I arrived at 6 p.m. sharp, carrying a bottle of wine despite David's instructions not to bring anything. The other guests were already there, drinks in hand, engaged in animated conversations about vacation plans and restaurant recommendations. Eleanor kissed my cheek and complimented my dress with the kind of enthusiasm that felt like charity. Marcus introduced me to his girlfriend as David's mom, with a tone that suggested I was a fond but distant relative, rather than the woman who'd raised the guest of honor. Dinner was served at a dining table that seated 8 comfortably, with place cards indicating where everyone should sit. I found my name at the far end of the table, across from Marcus and next to Sophia's sister-in-law, a quiet woman who spent most of the evening checking her phone. The conversation flowed around me like I was invisible. They discussed David's promotion at work, Sophia's new yoga instructor, Eleanor's plans to redecorate her guest bathroom. When someone mentioned a funny story about David's college years, they turned to Marcus for details, rather than asking me about my memories of that time. I tried to contribute, offering anecdotes about David's childhood or asking questions about their shared interests, but my attempts fell flat. Either the conversation had already moved on to another topic, or my stories were met with polite smiles that suggested they weren't quite appropriate for the sophisticated tone they'd established. During dessert, Sophia stood to make an announcement. "David and I have some exciting news to share," she said, her face glowing with happiness. "We're pregnant." The table erupted in congratulations and excitement. Eleanor clapped her hands together and immediately began talking about nursery themes and baby shower planning. Marcus proposed a toast to the next generation. Sophia's brother started calculating due dates and making jokes about sleepless nights. I sat at the end of the table, watching my son's face light up with joy, and realized I was witnessing the announcement as a bystander rather than a grandmother-to-be. Nobody turned to me for a reaction, or included me in the celebration planning. Eleanor was already discussing which country club would be best for the baby shower, while Sophia's sister-in-law offered to host a gender reveal party. "This is going to be the most spoiled baby in the world," Eleanor declared, and everyone laughed in agreement. "When are you due?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely audible over the excited chatter. "July," Sophia replied, but she was looking at Eleanor when she said it. "We're hoping for a summer baby so we can have lots of outdoor playtime in the garden." The garden at Eleanor's house, presumably. The grandchild I'd been dreaming about since David was born would grow up in Eleanor's world, with Eleanor's traditions and Eleanor's values. I would be the other grandmother, the one who got visits on alternating holidays if I was lucky. After dinner, I helped clear the table despite Sophia's protests that she could handle everything. I needed something to do with my hands, some way to feel useful in a house where I was clearly a guest rather than family. In the kitchen, I overheard Eleanor talking to David about baby preparations. "We'll need to start looking at preschools soon," she was saying. "The good ones have waiting lists that are years long. I have connections at St. Margaret's Academy. I think I can get the baby on the list before it's even born." St. Margaret's Academy, the private school that cost more per year than I made at the bakery, where children learned Latin and wore uniform blazers and called their teachers by their last names. A world away from the public school where David had thrived, where he'd played soccer and joined the drama club, and learned that success came from hard work rather than family connections. "That sounds perfect," David replied. "I want this baby to have every advantage. Every advantage except knowing its paternal grandmother, apparently." I finished loading the dishwasher and excused myself early, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely false. David hugged me goodbye with distracted affection, his mind already on nursery planning and college funds. "Thanks for coming, Mom. We'll have to do this more often once the baby arrives." More often. Like these monthly obligatory dinners weren't enough of a burden on their busy social calendar. I drove home through darkened streets, my mind racing with images of the future I could see unfolding. Birthday parties at Eleanor's house where I sat in the corner with the other peripheral relatives. School plays where I watched from the back row while Eleanor sat in the front with the rest of the real family. Graduations where my grandchild barely knew my name, but could recite Eleanor's accomplishments from memory. I would become a footnote in my own grandchild's life, the woman who sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts, but never quite earned a place at the important table. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and finally admitted the truth I'd been avoiding for months. This wasn't going to get better. David wasn't going to suddenly remember his loyalty to me or recognize what he'd lost. Sophia wasn't going to develop a warm relationship with the mother-in-law she saw as an embarrassing relic of her husband's past. I was being slowly, systematically erased from my son's life, and they were doing it so gradually, so politely, that I was supposed to be grateful for the crumbs they threw my way. But I wasn't grateful anymore. I was planning. The opportunity came 6 months later, when David called with devastating news. "Mom, I need to tell you something." His voice was tight with strain. "I went to the doctor yesterday for some tests. The results, they're not good." My heart stopped. "What kind of tests? What's wrong?" "They found something. A tumor. He paused, and I could hear him struggling with the words. "It's aggressive. They're going to try treatment, but the doctors aren't very optimistic." The world tilted sideways. My beautiful boy, my miracle baby, was sick. Seriously, terrifyingly sick. How long? I whispered. They're saying 6 months to a year, maybe longer if the treatment works. But Mom, I need you to know that we're going to fight this. Sophia and I, we're not giving up. Sophia and I. Even facing his own mortality, he spoke in terms of we that didn't include me. Over the next several weeks, I watched my son wage war against the disease that was consuming him from the inside. He underwent chemotherapy that left him weak and nauseous, radiation treatments that burned his skin and stole his appetite. Sophia was devoted, driving him to every appointment, researching alternative treatments, maintaining an optimistic facade that must have exhausted her. Eleanor organized the family response like a military campaign, coordinating meal deliveries and housekeeping services, managing David's medical schedule, and maintaining communication with his doctors. She created a system that was efficient and thorough, and completely excluded me from any meaningful role. I was allowed to visit twice a week, carefully scheduled around David's treatment appointments and rest periods. I could bring soup that he was too sick to eat, and books he was too tired to read. I could sit beside his bed and hold his hand while he dozed, counting every shallow breath and memorizing the shape of his face in case it was the last time I'd see him peaceful. But I wasn't included in medical consultations or treatment decisions. I wasn't asked for input on his care or consulted about end-of-life planning. When David's condition worsened and he needed round-the-clock care, Eleanor hired professional nurses to supplement Sophia's efforts. We want to make sure he has the best possible care, she explained when I offered to help. Professional nurses know how to handle his medications and monitor his condition. It's really specialized work. As if love and 32 years of experience caring for my child counted for nothing against professional training. David grew weaker as winter turned to spring, his once strong frame shrinking until he looked like a ghost of himself. But even in his illness, he remained devoted to Sophia and grateful to Eleanor for organizing his care. They had created a tight circle of support that kept him comfortable and surrounded by people who understood the gravity of his situation. I remained on the periphery, the visiting relative who brought flowers and stayed for carefully limited amounts of time so as not to tire the patient. The end came on a Thursday in April. I was at the bakery, kneading dough for the next day's bread, when my phone rang. Sophia's voice was barely controlled, thick with tears and exhaustion. "Margaret, you need to come now. David, the doctors say it's time." I drove to their condo with my heart in my throat, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. This was it. The moment I'd been dreading since the diagnosis. The moment when my son would leave me forever. The condo was full of people when I arrived. Eleanor, Sophia's brother and his wife, Marcus, several of David's colleagues from work. They spoke in whispers and moved with the careful solemnity of people who knew they were witnesses to something sacred and final. David was in his bedroom, propped up on pillows and connected to machines that monitored his fading vital signs. His breathing was labored, his skin pale and papery, but his eyes were alert when he saw me. "Mom," he whispered, reaching for my hand with fingers that felt like twigs. "I'm so glad you're here." I sat beside his bed and held his hand, stroking his hair the way I had when he was sick as a child. Around us, the other visitors maintained their vigil, talking softly about memories and expressing love and gratitude for having known him. As the hours passed, David's breathing became more difficult, his periods of consciousness shorter and less frequent. The nurses adjusted his medication to keep him comfortable, while Sophia held his other hand and whispered reassurances about their love and their baby, who would carry on his legacy. Around midnight, David's eyes opened one final time. He looked directly at me, his gaze more focused than it had been in weeks. "Mom," he said, his voice barely audible but perfectly clear. "I need to tell you something. About the wedding. About everything. I'm so sorry. I was wrong. Sophia, Eleanor, they made me believe, but they were wrong. You were the best mother. You deserved better. I love you. I'm sorry I forgot how much I love you." The words hung in the air like a blessing and a curse. Around the bed, I could feel the shocked silence as David's final confession settled over the room like a shroud. Sophia's face went white. Eleanor's carefully composed expression cracked. The other visitors shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that they'd witnessed something that changed everything they thought they knew about the family dynamics. "David, don't," Sophia started to say, but he was already gone. My son died holding my hand, with words of love and apology on his lips, finally acknowledging the truth we'd both been running from for too long. And Sophia, the strong, composed woman who'd managed his illness with such grace and efficiency, crumpled to the floor like her strings had been cut. In the chaos that followed, the nurses checking vital signs, Eleanor calling the funeral home, Marcus trying to comfort a hysterical Sophia. Nobody noticed me standing quietly beside my son's bed. Finally at peace for the first time in over a year, David had remembered who I was. David had remembered who he was, and in his final moments, he'd chosen truth over convenience, love over social expectations. It was the greatest gift he could have given me, and the most devastating blow he could have delivered to the people who'd tried to erase me. But as I looked around the room at their stricken faces, I realized that David's final words weren't just a confession, they were my vindication. And now everyone knew it. The funeral was held at St. Catherine's Cathedral, a grand stone building with soaring ceilings and stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across the marble floors. Eleanor had handled all the arrangements with her usual efficiency, choosing flowers and music and readings that reflected David's sophisticated tastes rather than the simple faith he'd grown up with. I sat in the front row for the first time in over 2 years. My position as David's mother, finally acknowledged and respected, but the victory felt hollow, purchased with my child's death and seasoned with grief so profound it made breathing feel like work. Sophia sat beside me in black silk and pearls, her pregnancy just beginning to show beneath her elegant dress. She hadn't spoken to me since David's final words at his deathbed, but she hadn't tried to exclude me from the funeral planning either. His confession had shifted something fundamental in the family dynamic, creating space for me to claim my rightful place as his mother. The service was beautiful and impersonal, full of classical music and poetry readings that could have applied to any accomplished young man taken too soon. David's colleagues spoke about his dedication and professionalism. Marcus talked about his evolution into a sophisticated, cultured person. Eleanor delivered a eulogy about a life well lived and a legacy that would continue through his coming child. Nobody mentioned the boy who'd made pancakes with his mother on Sunday mornings, or the young man who'd called every day just to check on me. Nobody talked about his laugh or his terrible jokes or the way he used to sing off-key in the car. They buried the David they'd created and celebrated, the polished version that fit so perfectly into their world. But I knew the truth. In his final moments, my son had remembered who he really was. After the service, there was a reception at Eleanor's country club, the same venue where they'd held the rehearsal dinner I hadn't been invited to. This time, I walked through the front door with my head held high, accepting condolences from people who'd spent months treating me like an embarrassing secret. Sophia's friends approached me with new respect, offering sympathy and sharing memories of David that painted him as the devoted husband and son-in-law they'd always believed him to be. But I could see the discomfort in their eyes, the awareness that his final words had revealed cracks in the perfect narrative they'd all accepted. Eleanor was cordial, but distant, her usual warmth replaced by something cooler and more careful. She knew that David's deathbed confession had exposed her manipulation, had revealed the cruelty behind her elegant management of the family dynamics, but she was too well-bred to acknowledge it directly, too experienced in social warfare to admit defeat publicly. Instead, she focused on Sophia and the coming grandchild, already making plans for the baby's future and discussing the importance of maintaining David's legacy through careful parenting and proper education. I listened to these conversations from the edges of the room, no longer hidden, but not yet fully included. David's final words had earned me a place at the table, but they hadn't erased 2 years of systematic exclusion or healed the wounds that his betrayal had inflicted. 3 months after the funeral, Sophia called me for the first time since David's death. "Margaret, it's Sophia. I was wondering, could we have lunch? There are some things I'd like to discuss with you." We met at a small cafe downtown, neutral territory that belonged to neither of us. Sophia looked tired, her pregnancy more visible now, her usual polished appearance softened by grief and hormones. She ordered tea and picked at a salad while I waited for her to explain why we were here. "I've been thinking about David's last words," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "about what he said to you." I waited, giving her space to find the words she needed. "I want you to know that I never meant to hurt you." When Eleanor suggested the arrangement at the wedding, it seemed like the kindest solution for everyone. "I thought you'd be more comfortable watching from somewhere quiet, away from all the chaos and social pressure." It was a careful apology, one that acknowledged wrongdoing without accepting full responsibility. Eleanor had suggested, Sophia had agreed, but the decision had been presented as consideration for my comfort, rather than their convenience. "David was struggling with how to balance everything," she continued. "His loyalty to you and his desire to fit into my family's world. Eleanor said she could help him find a way to honor both, to make sure everyone was included without creating conflict. By hiding me in a kitchen, I said quietly. Sophia's face crumpled. It was supposed to be temporary, just for the ceremony and the first part of the reception, until things settled down and we could figure out a better way to blend the families. But then David got caught up in the celebration, and time got away from us, and it was easier to leave me where I was. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. David felt terrible about it afterward. He wanted to apologize, to find a way to make it right, but Eleanor convinced him that bringing it up would only make everyone feel worse. She said it was better to move forward and make sure it never happened again. But it had happened again, over and over, in smaller and more subtle ways. Every excluded gathering, every delayed invitation, every conversation that stopped when I entered the room. They'd taken the wedding arrangement as a template for managing the Margaret problem going forward. "I'm sorry," Sophia whispered. "I'm so sorry for all of it. David loved you so much, and I let other people convince me that love was somehow inappropriate or unhealthy. I was wrong, and I can't take any of it back. It was the apology I'd been waiting for, the acknowledgement I'd needed to hear. But sitting in that cafe, watching my pregnant daughter-in-law dissolve into guilty tears, I realized that forgiveness was more complicated than I'd expected. I was angry at Sophia, but I also pitied her. She was young and had been raised in a world where social harmony was more important than emotional truth, where managing appearances took precedence over honoring relationships. Eleanor had presented the exclusion as sophisticated problem-solving, and Sophia had been naive enough to believe her. "What happens now?" I asked. "I want you to be part of this baby's life," she said immediately. "I want my child to know both grandmothers, to benefit from everything you have to offer." David would want that. It was a generous offer, one that promised a future very different from the marginalized role I'd been assigned. But I'd learned to be suspicious of promises from the Whitmore family, no matter how sincerely they were delivered. "What about Eleanor?" Sophia's expression tightened. "Eleanor will have to accept it. This is my child, and I get to decide who's involved in its life." David's final words, they changed everything for me. They made me realize how wrong we'd been about so many things. Over the following months, Sophia proved true to her word. She included me in doctor's appointments and baby shower planning, asked for my advice on nursery themes and parenting books. She seemed genuinely interested in rebuilding our relationship, in creating the family dynamic that should have existed from the beginning. But Eleanor's influence was harder to escape than either of us had anticipated. At baby shower planning meetings, she'd arrive with detailed lists and preferred vendors, overwhelming Sophia's tentative attempts at independent decision-making. During nursery shopping trips, she'd steer conversations toward expensive items from high-end stores, dismissing my suggestions for practical alternatives as sweet but not quite right. It wasn't malicious exactly. Eleanor was too sophisticated for outright cruelty. Instead, it was a masterclass in subtle dominance, the kind of social manipulation that left its targets feeling confused rather than angry. Sophia would leave these interactions with Eleanor's preferences firmly embedded in her decision-making process, convinced that she'd chosen everything herself. The baby was born on a humid July evening, a perfect little girl with David's dark hair and Sophia's delicate features. I held my granddaughter for the first time in the hospital room, marveling at her tiny fingers and the way she seemed to study my face with serious brown eyes. "Her name is Emma Rose," Sophia said softly. Emma for new beginnings, Rose for David's favorite flower. David had never mentioned having a favorite flower, but I didn't correct her. In death, my son had become whatever people needed him to be, and if Sophia needed him to have loved roses, that was her right as his widow. Eleanor arrived an hour later with an elaborate flower arrangement and a photographer to document Emma's first day. She took charge of the visiting schedule and the gift organization, ensuring that everything proceeded with proper decorum and efficiency. "She's absolutely perfect," Eleanor declared, holding Emma with the confidence of someone who'd raised successful children. "I can already see David in her features. She's going to be a beauty, just like her mother." It was a sweet sentiment that somehow managed to erase me entirely from Emma's genetic inheritance. According to Eleanor's narrative, my granddaughter was purely a product of the Whitmore and Anderson good breeding, with no need to acknowledge the Baker's bloodline that ran through her veins. But I held my tongue, focused on the miracle in my arms, rather than the politics surrounding her birth. Emma was here, healthy and beautiful, and I was being allowed to love her. After everything that had happened, that felt like enough. The first few months of Emma's life were a carefully choreographed dance of shared grandmothering. Sophia divided our visiting schedules and made sure we both felt included in important milestones. First smiles, rolling over, sitting up. It was artificial, but functional, a system that acknowledged both grandmother's importance while avoiding direct conflict. But as Emma grew older and more aware, the differences in our relationships with her became impossible to ignore. Eleanor's house became Emma's second home, with a fully equipped nursery and toys that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. She enrolled Emma in music classes and baby yoga, started a college fund that would cover Ivy League tuition, and began discussing the importance of early childhood development and intellectual stimulation. My role was more limited, the grandmother who sang lullabies and read picture books, who was good for quiet afternoons but not sophisticated enough for serious child-rearing decisions. When Emma started showing signs of advanced development, Eleanor connected Sophia with pediatric specialists and child psychologists. When she needed childcare, Eleanor provided nannies with impressive credentials and educational backgrounds. I provided love and attention, which apparently wasn't enough to compete with professional childcare and expert guidance. By Emma's first birthday, the family dynamic had settled into a familiar pattern. Eleanor was the primary grandmother, the one who hosted holiday celebrations and made important decisions about Emma's future. I was the secondary grandmother, invited to participate but not to lead, included but not essential. It was better than being hidden in a kitchen, but it still felt like being managed rather than embraced. Emma's first birthday party was held at Eleanor's house, a lavish affair with professional decorations and a guest list that included everyone who mattered in Sophia's social circle. I arrived early to help with preparations, only to discover that everything had already been handled by Eleanor's staff. "Margaret, you look lovely," Eleanor greeted me with air kisses and a smile that was warm but not quite genuine. "Everything's under control here, but thank you for offering to help. Why don't you relax and enjoy yourself?" I spent Emma's first birthday party sitting on Eleanor's living room sofa, watching my granddaughter charm a room full of people I barely knew. She was walking now, toddling from guest to guest with the confident smile of a child who knew she was adored. When she saw me, she reached up with chubby arms, babbling gamma in the way that melted my heart every time. But when the professional photographer started taking family portraits, I found myself once again on the periphery. The main shots featured Sophia holding Emma, Eleanor standing proudly beside them, representing the continuing Whitmore legacy. I was included in a few group photos, standing slightly apart from the central family unit, smiling for pictures that would probably end up in a drawer rather than displayed on Eleanor's mantelpiece. During cake time, Eleanor stood to make a toast to Emma's first year and the bright future ahead of her. She talked about family traditions and the importance of giving children every advantage, about the responsibilities that came with privilege and the joy of watching the next generation flourish. "To Emma," she concluded, raising her champagne glass, "may she always know how much she is loved and how many people are invested in her success." The toast was beautiful and completely generic, the kind of sentiment that could apply to any well-loved child, but it reinforced the message that had been building throughout the party. Emma's future would be shaped by people who understood how to provide advantages and opportunities, people who knew how to navigate the world of privilege and achievement, people like Eleanor, not people like me. After the party, I helped clean up while Emma napped in her stroller and Sophia rested on the back patio. Eleanor and I worked in comfortable silence, packing up leftover food and organizing gift bags, both of us tired from the afternoon's festivities. "It was a lovely party," I offered, as we folded tablecloths and collected decorations. "Thank you. I wanted Emma's first birthday to be special. There's something magical about those early milestones, don't you think?" I agreed, though I couldn't help thinking about David's first birthday, celebrated in our tiny apartment with a grocery store cake and 3 guests. It had been special in its own way, full of love and hope and the simple joy of marking our baby's first year of life. "Margaret," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice taking on a more serious tone, "I hope you know how much I appreciate everything you've done for this family. David was lucky to have such a devoted mother, and Emma is lucky to have you as a grandmother." It was a gracious statement, one that acknowledged my importance without threatening Eleanor's position as the primary family matriarch. But there was something in her tone that made me look up from the tablecloth I was folding. "I hope you also understand that Sophia and Emma's future requires guidance, stability, the kind of support system that can provide real advantages in a competitive world. There it was, the gentle reminder that love alone wasn't enough, that Emma would need more than what I could provide if she was going to succeed in the world Eleanor had mapped out for her. I want what's best for Emma, I said carefully. Of course you do. We all do. That's why it's so important that we work together, each of us contributing what we do best. You bring warmth and affection, which is wonderful. I bring experience and resources. Together, we can give Emma everything she needs. It was a reasonable division of labor that cast me as the emotional support and Eleanor as the practical guide. But I'd heard this kind of language before. The careful negotiations that had preceded my exile from David's wedding and my marginalization in his married life. Eleanor was already planning Emma's future, and that future had a very specific shape, one that required professional management and sophisticated guidance. I could be part of it, but only in a supporting role, only as long as I didn't interfere with the larger vision. I drove home from Emma's first birthday party with a familiar feeling in my stomach, the same sick certainty that had preceded every major disappointment in my relationship with David's new family. They were doing it again, slowly, politely, systematically reducing my role until I became a pleasant but peripheral figure in my granddaughter's life. But this time, I wasn't going to wait until it was too late to fight back. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a legal pad, making lists and plans with the kind of methodical precision I'd learned from watching Eleanor operate. If she could manipulate family dynamics through careful strategy and patient execution, then so could I. I had advantages she didn't know about. David's final words had given me moral authority, and Emma's love for me was already established and genuine. Most importantly, I had nothing left to lose. David was gone, and if they succeeded in marginalizing me again, I would lose my granddaughter too. But I also had something Eleanor had never possessed, the absolute, unconditional love of a mother who'd already lost everything once and refused to let it happen again. It was time to remind the Whitmore family that quiet women could be the most dangerous adversaries of all. The war for Emma's heart began with small gestures and grew into something larger and more strategic over time. I started by establishing traditions that belonged exclusively to our relationship. Weekly baking sessions where Emma helped me make cookies and learned to measure ingredients. Storytelling sessions where I shared tales about her daddy's childhood. Quiet afternoons where we worked in my small garden, and she learned the names of flowers and vegetables. These activities were simple and inexpensive, but they created bonds that couldn't be purchased or professionalized. When Emma was with me, she was just a loved child, rather than a project to be optimized. She could be messy and silly and completely herself without anyone correcting her posture or redirecting her energy toward educational objectives. Sophia supported these visits enthusiastically, recognizing that Emma was happier and more relaxed after spending time with me. But Eleanor watched our growing closeness with increasing unease, subtle attempts to schedule competing activities or suggest more enriching alternatives for Emma's free time. "Margaret does such a nice job with Emma," she'd say to Sophia, her tone carefully neutral. "Though I do worry that all those sweets might not be the best foundation for healthy eating habits. And the garden work, well, it's charming, but Emma's skin is so fair. Too much sun exposure at her age could cause problems later." These weren't direct criticisms, just gentle expressions of concern that planted seeds of doubt about my caregiving methods. Eleanor was too sophisticated to attack me directly, but she was perfectly willing to undermine my relationship with Emma through careful suggestions and implied warnings. The breaking point came when Emma was 3 years old, and Eleanor announced her intention to enroll her in an exclusive preschool program that would prepare her for eventual admission to St. Margaret's Academy. "It's a very competitive program," Eleanor explained during one of our increasingly tense family dinners. "Only 20 children per year, selected based on developmental assessments and family interviews. But it's the best possible foundation for academic success." The program met 5 days a week from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., with additional enrichment activities available until 6 p.m. It would consume most of Emma's waking hours and leave little time for the informal activities she enjoyed with me. "She's only 3, I said carefully. "Isn't that quite young for such an intensive program?" "Early childhood education is crucial," Eleanor replied with the authority of someone who'd researched the topic thoroughly. "The brain develops so rapidly at this age. Every month we delay could impact her long-term potential." Sophia looked uncertain, torn between Eleanor's expertise and her own instincts about what Emma needed. "Maybe we could try it part-time, see how she adjusts?" The program doesn't offer part-time enrollment, Eleanor said smoothly. It's designed as an immersive experience. Half measures won't provide the same benefits. I could see the future unfolding with terrible clarity. Emma would disappear into Eleanor's world of structured learning and achievement-oriented activities, emerging only for carefully scheduled visits that fit around her academic commitments. Our baking sessions and garden adventures would become occasional treats rather than regular traditions. What does Emma want? I asked. Everyone looked at me like I'd suggested consulting the family dog. She's 3 years old, Eleanor said with patient condescension. She wants ice cream for breakfast and to stay up all night. That's why children need adults to make decisions for them. But Emma had opinions, even at 3. She preferred picture books to educational videos, finger painting to structured art projects, digging in dirt to playing with expensive toys. She was a happy, curious child who thrived on affection and exploration rather than optimization and achievement. Maybe we should consider what kind of childhood we want Emma to have, I suggested. David was happy playing in public playgrounds and attending community daycare. He turned out fine. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor's expression sharpened, while Sophia looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. David was a wonderful man, Eleanor said finally. But the world is more competitive now than it was 30 years ago. Children need every advantage we can provide. What she didn't say, but what everyone heard, was that David's childhood with me had been adequate, but not optimal. My methods had produced a good man, but Eleanor's methods would produce a superior one. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my lawyer. Actually, I didn't have a lawyer. I had Bill Morrison, the man who'd handled my divorce paperwork 15 years earlier and helped me set up my small business. But Bill had connections, and he understood family law well enough to give me the information I needed. Grandparents' rights are complicated in this state, he explained over coffee at a diner downtown. You can petition for visitation rights, but you'd need to prove that your relationship with Emma is important for her welfare, and that denying you access would harm her. What if they don't deny me access? What if they just manage it so that I become less and less important in her life? Bill frowned, recognizing the subtlety of my situation. That's harder to prove legally. Courts generally defer to parental decision-making unless there's clear evidence of harm. What about David's final words? The deathbed confession where he acknowledged that they'd treated me badly? Interesting, Bill mused. Were there witnesses? 6 people heard him say it, including Eleanor and Sophia. That could be significant. It suggests that your exclusion was deliberate and that David himself recognized it was wrong, but you'd still need to prove that Emma's relationship with you is being threatened. I spent the next several weeks documenting everything. Eleanor's subtle, undermining comments, the systematic scheduling of activities that conflicted with my visits, the increasing pressure on Sophia to choose more enriching alternatives to our simple traditions. But I also did something more important. I talked to Emma, not about the adult conflicts or custody issues. She was far too young for that kind of burden. Instead, I asked her simple questions about what she enjoyed, what made her happy, what she looked forward to during our time together. I like making cookies with you, Gamma, she told me one afternoon as we rolled out sugar cookie dough. Nana Eleanor says cookies aren't good for me, but you make them taste like hugs. What else do you like to do? I like the garden. I like when you tell me stories about Daddy when he was little. I like when we're quiet together and don't have to do anything important. My 3-year-old granddaughter was already feeling the pressure to be constantly productive, constantly improving, constantly working towards some distant goal of optimization. Would you be sad if you couldn't come visit Gamma as much? I asked gently. Emma's face crumpled. Are you going away like Daddy did? No, sweetheart. Gamma's not going anywhere. I was just wondering, but she'd answered my question. Emma valued our relationship, looked forward to our time together, and would be genuinely harmed by losing regular access to me. That had to count for something, even in Eleanor's world of strategic parenting. The custody hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in October. I arrived at the courthouse with Bill beside me, my hands shaking slightly as we walked through security and found our assigned courtroom. Sophia was there with her own lawyer, not the expensive family law firm I'd expected, but a younger woman who looked nervous and underprepared. Eleanor sat in the gallery behind them, her presence a reminder of who was really orchestrating the opposition to my petition. This is highly unusual, Sophia's lawyer argued. Mrs. Anderson has regular visitation with her granddaughter. She's not being denied access. She's simply not satisfied with the amount of time she's been granted. My client isn't seeking to increase her visitation hours, Bill responded. She's seeking to protect the relationship she already has from systematic interference. He presented our evidence methodically, documented instances of Eleanor's undermining comments, the increasing pressure to replace our informal activities with structured programs, the pattern of exclusion that had begun with David's wedding and continued through his illness and death. The deceased's final words are particularly relevant, Bill argued. In front of multiple witnesses, David Anderson acknowledged that his family had treated his mother badly and apologized for allowing it to happen. This deathbed confession suggests that Mrs. Anderson's concerns about systematic exclusion are not imaginary, but represent a continuing pattern of behavior. Sophia's lawyer objected to the relevance of deathbed statements, but Judge Morrison, no relation to my Bill, allowed the testimony. One by one, witnesses confirmed what David had said in his final moments, that he was sorry, that he'd been wrong to allow his mother's exclusion, that she deserved better treatment. Eleanor was called as a witness, and I watched her navigate the questioning with the same poised competence she brought to everything else. She acknowledged David's final words, but characterized them as the confused rambling of a dying man, rather than a clear-eyed confession. David was heavily medicated and emotionally distraught, she testified. I don't think we can put much weight on statements made under those circumstances, but you heard him clearly apologize to his mother. I heard him say words that could be interpreted that way. And prior to his death, were you involved in decisions about Mrs. Anderson's role in family events? Eleanor's composure flickered slightly. I helped coordinate family gatherings, yes. David and Sophia often asked for my advice about social situations, including where Mrs. Anderson should sit at the wedding. I helped with seating arrangements for all the guests. And you felt it was appropriate to seat the groom's mother in the third row? I felt it was appropriate to seat everyone in a way that would make the ceremony as comfortable as possible for all involved. It was skillfully evasive testimony, but Judge Morrison seemed unimpressed by Eleanor's careful deflections. When my turn came, I spoke simply and directly about my relationship with Emma and my concerns about its future. I don't want to take Emma away from anyone, I testified. I just want to protect what we have. She's the only family I have left, and I'm afraid that if I don't speak up now, she'll disappear from my life the same way her father did. The judge deliberated for 30 minutes before returning with her decision. While the court recognizes that parents have broad discretion in making decisions about their children's care and education, she said, there is sufficient evidence to suggest that Mrs. Anderson's relationship with her granddaughter is both important to the child's welfare and at risk of systematic interference. She awarded me protected visitation rights, guaranteed time with Emma that couldn't be reduced or canceled without court approval, and prohibited any family member from making negative comments about our activities or attempting to replace them with enriching alternatives. This court will not allow a child to be deprived of a loving relationship with her grandmother due to social manipulation or class prejudice, Judge Morrison concluded. Mrs. Anderson's methods of childcare may be simpler than what others might prefer, but there is no evidence that they are harmful to the child. Indeed, the evidence suggests that Emma thrives in her grandmother's care. I walked out of that courthouse with legal protection for my relationship with Emma, but more importantly, with public validation of what David had acknowledged in his final moments. I wasn't the problem. I never had been. The people who'd tried to erase me were the problem, and now a judge had said so officially. 6 months later, Emma started at a small community preschool 3 days a week, leaving her Tuesdays and Thursdays free for our traditional activities. Eleanor's exclusive academic program remained empty of Whitmore grandchildren, while Emma continued to flourish in an environment that valued creativity and emotional development alongside intellectual growth. Sophia and I rebuilt our relationship slowly, based on mutual respect rather than careful management. She'd learned through the custody proceedings that love and loyalty couldn't be strategically allocated, that authentic relationships required honoring people for who they were rather than trying to improve them into something more suitable. Eleanor remained polite but distant, her influence over family decisions significantly reduced. She still saw Emma regularly, but their interactions were balanced by equal time with me, and the dynamic between us had shifted from manipulation to grudging coexistence. But the real victory was Emma herself. still joyful and curious and wonderfully herself, secure in the knowledge that she was loved by multiple people who each brought different gifts to her life. She would grow up knowing both grandmothers, benefiting from Eleanor's resources and connections while remaining grounded in the simpler values I represented. On Emma's 4th birthday, we held the party in my small garden instead of Eleanor's elegant mansion. It was a modest affair with homemade decorations and a cake I'd baked myself, attended by neighbors and preschool friends rather than social connections. Emma spent the afternoon digging in dirt and chasing butterflies, her party dress stained with soil and her hair tangled with flower petals. She looked absolutely radiant, completely happy in the simple celebration we'd created together. As the sun set and parents began collecting their children, Emma climbed into my lap and rested her head against my shoulder. "Gamma," she whispered sleepily, "this was the best birthday ever." I held my granddaughter close and thought about David's final words, about forgiveness and justice, and the long road that had led us to this moment of perfect peace. He'd been wrong to let them hide me, but he'd found the courage to acknowledge his mistake when it mattered most. And because of that courage, Emma would never have to choose between loving me and fitting into their world. She could have both, could be both, rooted in simple values but with access to broader opportunities, grounded in authentic love but capable of navigating sophisticated social situations. She would be everything David had never quite managed to be, true to herself while still embracing the best of what others had to offer. As I tucked Emma into the car seat for Sophia to drive her home, she reached up and patted my cheek with one small, sticky hand. "I love you, Gamma. Don't ever go away." "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart," I promised. "Gamma will always be right here when you need her." And this time, I knew it was a promise I could keep. The little girl who could have been hidden away like her grandmother had been, was now surrounded by love from all sides, free to grow into whoever she was meant to become. David's final words had saved more than just my relationship with Emma. They'd saved Emma herself from a future where love was conditional and family was something to be managed rather than cherished. Sometimes the truth comes at the very end, when there's nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Sometimes it takes a dying man's confession to reveal what everyone should have known all along. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that truth arrives just in time to save the next generation from repeating the same mistakes. Like this video. If Margaret's story moved you, subscribe for more incredible family drama, and comment below with your own experiences of family manipulation and finding justice. Your story could be featured in our next episode.